Hi, this is week 6 theorist on Robert Gagne. Robert Gagne was born in August 21st, 1916 in the U.S., and he died April 28th in 2002. Robert Gagne graduated high school in 1932 from North Andover, Massachusetts High, and then he went on to get his undergraduate degree in psychology from Yale in 1937. And then shortly after getting his undergraduate, he received his PhD in psychology from Brown. And something that was kind of interesting is that his advising professor helped Gagne get his PhD in some experiments using operant conditioning. He then, after getting his PhD, receiving his PhD, taught at the Women's College in Connecticut. Then, in 1942, was drafted into the Army Air Corps. And this time in his life was very influential to Robert Gagne, like I'll mention in a future slide. But he really started becoming interested in learning how people learn and how people can be taught during his time here. So after his time in the military, he went and actually taught back at Connecticut College for a little while, and then moved on to teach at Pennsylvania State University. And then was called back from one of the psychologists that he worked with while in the Army Corps to work for the military, specifically the Air Force, in how they could better train pilots. After his time in the military, his second round in the military, he moved to Princeton and was a professor there. And then decided to go work kind of not in academia, but instead work as the director of research for American Institute of Research in 1962. And during this time, he started doing research on education in public schools, and gained an interest in just educational psychology. And then he went to be a professor at Berkeley in 1966. And then shortly after that, went to work at Florida State University in the Educational Research Department. And this is where he spent a majority of his career, was at Florida State University. Some of the influences that Robert Gagne had were his, a guy named Clarence Graham, who was his graduate advisor at Brown when he was getting his PhD. And he became interested here in the learning process. And again, Graham had kind of furthered a theory of operant conditioning, and that had some influences on Robert Gagne. And then when he went shortly after getting his PhD to work in his first time with the military, he worked really closely with three psychologists, Arthur Melton, James Gibson, and Paul Fitts. And all four of these guys worked to train pilots and people who worked in the Army Air Corps to better do their job. So they were just taught very specific skills and how best to teach these skills, or how best to allow these skills to be mastered. And while his time here, he found that depending on the skill that you were trying to improve, it took a little bit different approach to learning. So some similarities and differences to some theorists that we've talked about already, and specific, and ones that we haven't actually, but theorists at the time pretty much, I guess, all believed that human learning could be described using a single description. It was all pretty just general. If you do this, people are going to learn. was kind of the mentality. And Gagne didn't believe that was the case, especially from his experience in the military. He thought that humans were much more complex than a lot of the animals that they'd been, doing their experiments on, and thought that because humans are so different, they would require more than just the signal response stuff that like Thorndike believed in, and Skinner believed. And it was just more complicated than that. Not that you couldn't learn that way, but there were skills that could be taught better in more efficient ways than just what they'd been currently looking at. So Gagne was also similar to Thorndike in that complex tasks are made up of just a bunch of more basic tasks. And that was essentially what Thorndike's bonding theory was. And Gagne believed that to be true, that everything that was very complex was really just made up of a bunch of less complex, more basic tasks. And we'll talk about this here in just a little while. So Gagne also believed that learning was evidenced in observable change in behavior. So kind of had this behaviorist leaning as opposed to a constructivist view. And then I put similarities and differences to Bruner's ideas of readiness. I was thinking about using this as one of the discussion questions, and then I changed my mind. But similarities or differences is kind of what I really want to talk about with Bruner, in that Bruner didn't think that, mastery of a skill, from what I understand, was something that was very important. Like everyone could understand something, even if it was at a very basic level. Now, Gagne didn't believe that to be the case. He believed that there had to be some prerequisite skills in place in order for this ability to perform a skill or to understand a skill. So some important works that Gagne's produced, two really big ones, are The Conditions of Learning, that was first published in 1965 and has since had, I think, 4 editions to it, and then Principles of Instructional Design, which was written in 1974. So on to some of Gagne's theories. So he believed, again, that humans were more complex than animals, and there were kind of 5 different categories for learning, which each took a little bit of a different approach to. 2 of these 5 will be mentioned in the reading that we have for this week. The first one is verbal information, and this is essentially just being able to recall facts and information. Anything that could be described verbally or written would fall in this category. So it's very, very basic kind of stuff. An example that they gave in the reading was, the ability to know that, Columbus, quote, discovered America in 1492. That was an example of verbal information. Intellectual skills required more process, more of an intellectual process to be able to do. It wasn't just recall, but it was, for instance, it'll mention in the reading that pretty much everything in math falls in this category. So the ability to, quote, do math would be considered an intellectual skill. And then we don't really focus too much in the reading on cognitive and motor and attitudes, but essentially cognitive is metacognition, thinking of how we think. Motor skills is the ability to perform a task physically. And then attitudes would be, just what your disposition is for one thing over another. Okay, so one of Gagne's big theories was his idea of learning hierarchies. And this is what our reading is really going to be focused on this week. And it essentially says that all complex tasks are made up of a bunch of prerequisite skills that first have to be mastered in order for you to be able to accomplish whatever the goal is. They sometimes call it a terminal objective. I think they use that term in the reading that is assigned this week. So in order to perform this final goal, you first have to have all these like previous skills mastered. And this is an example of a learning hierarchy. So the overall goal that Gagne would say this is, the what we want to accomplish would be subtracting whole numbers of any size. But before you can do that, you'd have to master all these skills that are below it, that come before. And this diagram is on the handout, so you can kind of look at that, on the handout there. But yeah, if any of these prerequisite skills aren't met, then it's not likely that you will be able to accomplish this last skill. So the implications for teaching, especially with the learning hierarchy in mind, is that it's going to influence instruction by emphasizing the need to have pre-tests to determine if students have the prior knowledge required to accomplish an educational task. Because if they don't know one of these prerequisite skills, according to Gagne, they're not going to be able to master the new thing that we're asking them to do. And then also it's going to influence curriculum designers to determine a sequence of lessons, so you can be sure that students will be able to master the more complex skill that they're trying to be taught. In one of the readings that I had, it had mentioned that it's probably more impactful to curriculum designers than it is to actual classroom teachers. So my personal relationship to the learning hierarchy theory is, that I believe that if you want a student to be able to perform a specific skill, especially if that skill is like an algorithm or something, it's important for them to understand the skills before, like Gagne says in his learning hierarchy, and a way that that I guess I personally use this in my classroom is in the class that I teach called Transition to College Algebra. We have a program that comes with the curriculum that we use called Agile Mind, which is an online thing. And for every lesson, there's a preview assignment that students are required to do the day before the lesson, and it has all these prerequisite skills. And it says that if these students aren't able to do these specific preview tasks, then they're not going to be able to they're not going to be successful in the new lesson that we're covering, or the new material that we're covering. And so students need to come in and kind of get help and a refresher on how to do these prerequisite skills. Yeah, and I'm also like not as similar, I guess, with Gagne in his idea of readiness. I think I probably align more with Bruner in that all students with the help of scaffolding can conceptualize or understand whatever task we're wanting them to do. But yeah, so the discussion questions that we've got from this week's reading, which by the way, I'm really sorry, it's 14 pages. I know the week 5's readings were really short, and it was really, really nice. And mine's a little bit longer, so sorry about that. But the questions are, what are Gagne's views of what mathematics is and how it is learned based on the reading that were assigned, and do your views align with Gagne? And then what role, if any, do learning hierarchies have in your classroom? You could explain your answer, and then do you believe that using learning hierarchies can be useful for remediation? Just I'd be interested to hear what your guys' thoughts are on those things. And here's a list of references that I looked at to create this presentation. Thank you guys very much for listening.